When we look at these figures from thousands of years ago, do we see ourselves reflected in them? How do they face their setbacks? And how do we? Do we distance ourselves from them? Do we hunt for someone to blame? Do we shrug and assume that we'll land on our feet somehow? Once upon a time, there was a billionaire. All his wealth was tied up in the land he inherited from his family, and he never wanted to lift a finger to improve it. So he hired a manager to take care of his land and to take care of his wealth for him. But the billionaire couldn't even be bothered to make sure his manager was doing a good job. So eventually the manager said to himself, well, if my boss doesn't notice when I'm managing his money and his property well, let's see if he notices when I squander it. So the manager gave himself a raise, bought a bigger house, started dining in fancy restaurants, wearing fancy clothes. It was all going great until one day, when another manager noticed how he was living and got jealous. I'm doing the same job as he's doing. Why should he be living in that big house and not me? So he decided to go and tell the billionaire what his manager had been up to. And of course, you know what happens next. The billionaire summarily fires his manager for his mismanagement. But before the word can spread, the manager sets out to make himself a hero with his boss's clients in hopes that he can land a good job on his way out. But then, plot twist. The rich man, the billionaire, who was furious with his manager for squandering his money, now applauds him for squandering even more of it. What is going on here? It's confusing, for sure. And we are so often confused by the parables of Jesus. And I think the reason for this is that we're not familiar with the storytelling conventions of Jesus' time. We tend to think of every one of Jesus' stories as either a straight allegory or a tale of good guy versus bad guy. Now, if we approach it like an allegory, then we want to make one of these characters represent God the Father, or God the Son, or maybe Israel, or the church. But none of these characters can be mapped onto that reality. So it's not an allegory, and it can't be a tale of good guy versus bad guy either, because there are no good guys. Just a couple of jerks. So if it's not an allegory, and it's not good guy versus bad guy, what is it? I believe that this story of Jesus is part of a subgenre that I like to call the how much more so stories. The most famous example of this subgenre is the parable of the unjust judge, found in Luke 18. Every story in this subgenre features an unfaithful person doing something admirable, and then asking us the question, how much more so should we expect a faithful person to do it? Jesus doesn't mean for us to reflect the dishonest manager any more than he expects God to reflect the unjust judge. These characters are a foil. designed to create contrast and make a larger point. So the question is, are we getting the point? Is this really an object lesson about wealth? Maybe. Or maybe it's a case study in how we respond to our trials. When we look at these figures from thousands of years ago, do we see ourselves reflected in them? How do they face their setbacks? And how do we? Do we distance ourselves from them? Do we hunt for someone to blame? Do we shrug and assume that we'll land on our feet somehow? If we could learn anything from this dishonest manager, perhaps it would be to look our circumstances square in the eye. When climate change brings natural disasters, we might cry out in anguish, apologize to our neighbors for our greed and carelessness, and set about looking for a solution to the problem. When our politics reaches a climax of hate and division, we might grieve the relationships we've lost and acknowledge our own pride and divisiveness. We might beg God for forgiveness and set about working toward a solution. When we encounter one crisis after another in the world, we might be honest with God and with each other. And in the process, we might actually find a way to make the world better. If even a faithless, dishonest manager can be honest about his situation, acknowledge his losses, and make the most of what he has, how much more so can we, the faithful?